Welcome to our second lecture of 2018 from the Key Biscayne Life Enhancement Forum, where we focus on healthy living and healthy aging. We're very lucky. Today we have Key Biscayne resident, or guest, part-time resident, Karl Gross. Dr. Gross is from Vienna, Austria, where he graduated in 1984. He went to residency school at University of Colorado and was in private practice of neurology in Denver until 1999 when he developed MS. He's going to share with us today what he has learned in terms of dealing with MS on a daily basis and some of the alternative practices that have helped him. Dr. Gross has been coming to Key Biscayne for the last 5 years? 5 years, yeah. And for the last 4 of those 5 years, he has been part of the Tai Chi group that Marius leads. And what Marius shared with me is that you were a great student of Tai Chi, and you always made sure that you had each of the moves down and did it very correctly. And I've been lucky because I joined the group just a few weeks ago. And you are a great student. Great. So hopefully I will one day be where you are. Thank you, Dr. Gross.
Thank you. Thank you, Melissa, for this nice introduction. And thank you all for coming. You've heard my background, and I want to get going right away with my slides. I've been asked to talk about alternative treatments of MS in order to understand a little bit how alternative treatments for MS would be working. I think it's important to know a little bit about what MS is. Some of you may know quite a lot, whether they wanted to or not, as I've talked with you before. Others may not be that familiar with it. I want to first, as is customary before such talks, tell you that in the past I've done a lot of these presentations at the behest of pharmaceutical companies or the MS Society, both in this country and in Europe. Tonight's talk is not sponsored by any company. I've been invited by the Key Biscayne Community Foundation, by Marius and Melissa, to do this, and I'm very happy to be here. So there's no particular pharmaceutical or other sponsor, just as a way of disclosure. As you heard in the introduction, I have kind of I wear 2 hats. I'm a neurologist, now retired because of the MS, but I also am a patient. So physicians tend to look at diseases in a very hard-nosed, rational, scientific, you might even say mathematical fashion. And patients deal with the problems on a totally different level, on a subjective, experiential level. And the 2 views don't always meet. And I'm going to try to cover this topic from both angles, switching back and forth, but kind of emphasize the physician level and the data level to some degree. MS, it's called multiple sclerosis because it has multiple symptoms. Basically, you're getting areas of inflammation in the brain and in the spinal cord. And this leads to a whole plethora of symptoms that can happen, but there are some that are very common. Vision symptoms are very common, whether it's losing vision in one eye or double vision, weakness, any kind of sensory abnormalities, bladder problems, you name it. You can get pain syndromes from that. And depending on where in the brain or spinal cord these areas of inflammation happen. They're not big, but the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord are very dense tissues. And therefore, a small lesion can cause a lot of trouble. And typically in MS, these things come and go. These things start before we ever get diagnosed with MS. We know that from people who have MRI scans for other reasons, because they have a car accident or they have headaches or whatever, get an MRI scan and you see MS lesions. So before somebody gets to the clinical threshold of symptoms, before they ever know that they have MS, we know that there are already inflammations happening. Sooner or later, they break through this level, and then people start noticing that there's something wrong. And they go typically through a phase of having symptoms for days or weeks, and then they get better. They may go away completely or not. And then this pattern continues, and as the years go on, most patients develop fewer of these exacerbations, and they kind of progress more gradually. I've given you just the typical scenario. There are other forms where things happen in a different way, but I want to come to my main topic and not spend too much time on the technical details of that. There is a big mistake that people make sometimes when they have little disability when the disease begins. They can make it 10 or 15 or 30 years. And on a disability scale, a medical disability scale, they may have very little. But nearly all of them, if you look at them, that have had the disease for 10, 20 years and have very little disability, if you then wait another 10 years and look at them again, then nearly all of them are worse. There are some that escape for a long time, but very few escape forever. Sooner or later, the disease gets worse. MS is a curious disease in terms of its distribution. In Europe and North America, there's the highest incidence that is known. Around the equator, it tends to be least. And then, as you get to the southern hemisphere, it actually increases again. And there has been a lot of debate of what the reasons for this odd distribution is. It could be genetic, because people with certain genetic backgrounds like to live in cold climates, or whether they like it or not, do live in cold climates. And it could also be something in the environment that's different. The latest estimate is that in the US, there is about 1 million people with MS. It used to be said for a couple of decades now that the number was more around 400,000. Turns out that's not true, as was suspected, and it's probably about 1 million. The US has 325 million people currently, so 1 million out of 325 million. So it's not that infrequent a disease. What is it? I talked about areas of inflammation, and on a cut brain, you see patches, we'll see some MRI scans later, of inflamed tissues. And there's also on the microscopic level, the nerve fibers themselves in the brain and spinal cord are damaged. This is an MRI scan, and the yellow arrows, as well as the red ones, indicate these white patches, which are the MS lesions. So they tend to happen around what's called the ventricles, the fluid spaces in the brain, and they are multiple, including in the brain stem and the spinal cord, which are very dense CNS areas that are very important for things like swallowing and for the brain to communicate with the body. If I want to tell my right foot to do this, my left side of the brain has to send a signal there. And it all has to pass through the spinal cord. And if my leg needs to tell my brain that the ground is kind of uneven, that has to go up through different pathways. Your spinal cord is about as big as your little finger in diameter. So even a small lesion can cause a lot of problems. Just think of an electrical cable where half the wires don't work. You're going to have predictable results. Next one. Here you see another typical MS lesion. This happens to be one of my own scans from a couple of years ago. One is pretty big and easily noticeable. There are a couple of smaller ones here and here. Next one. There's one more on that side, and then the last one. I'm not going to bore you with this too long. Next slide. In the spinal cord, you can probably see it. I can't reach up with my finger, but you can probably see that little white dutzel. Well, I can't. So there are three factors that are felt to be contributing: infections, genetic factors, and environment. Why a particular person may get MS. Genetic factors are pretty likely because in identical twins, if one gets MS, the other one has a very high chance, about 30 to 35%, of also getting MS. In fraternal twins that are like brother and sister, or brother and brother, but not identical, that don't have identical genes, that incidence goes down to 3%. So if one of the fraternal twins gets MS, the other one has the same as a brother or sister of an MS patient would have. But whereas if the twin is identical genetically, then it shoots up to 30%. So from that, it's rather clear that genes play a role. But they can't be the only factor. Otherwise, with identical twins, we would have to have 100% concordance because the genes are completely identical. So factors in the environment or with infections most likely play a role. And I'll come back to the infections theory in a little bit. Environment, of course, is a big kind of term. What's part of that? Well, infections in a way are part of the environment because we generally get infected by other people or by bugs in the environment, and they may be different in the cold climates versus hot climate, etc. All of this together leads to an abnormal immune response, and in the case of MS, this immune response is directed against the white matter of the brain and spinal cord, the fatty insulating tissue around the nerve fibers. In rheumatoid arthritis, you get an immune response against the cartilage and other structures in the joints. In lupus, you get it against portions of the blood vessels. In other Sjogren's disease or Crohn's, you get it in other tissues. The basis of the autoimmune disease is that the body's immune system, instead of attacking bad stuff coming from the outside, is directed against portions of your own body that it should be leaving alone. This was the state of knowledge about 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And I'm showing this mostly in talks like this just to impress upon people how complicated the immune system is. And that when you read little bottles in the grocery store or the health food store, helps to strengthen the immune system, I hope in the future you smile, because you're going to remember this and say, and what does that mean? Because you don't know if you're strengthening an arm that does this or that does that. There are complicated regulatory mechanisms of one portion of the immune system suppressing another part, which you don't want. So a statement that something is strengthening the immune system is a very vague kind of thing. And similarly, weakening the immune system, if you weaken the right thing, it may help you. If you weaken the wrong part of this rather complicated system, you may be doing yourself not a favor at all in terms of treating a disease. This is a little bit more current. It's gotten more complicated. This is all about a part of the immune system called the Th17 cells that nobody knew when that first slide was made 20 years ago. And there are many, many more things. Next one. Immune suppression wants to basically shut the whole thing down. Next one. And then there are targeted treatments against particular areas of the immune system that may help in MS. Ocrevus goes against B cells. And I've talked with somebody about a particular treatment of MS called Ocrevus that's new. That was not even in the crosshairs 20 years ago when this slide was made. This was the interferon era. And we were very interested in the Th1 cells. And that's what interferons work against, basically. And Copaxone was thought to actually work for or reestablish a balance with Th2. And now the big money is on suppressing the B cells that create antibodies that then damage the myelin. That's the theory. So next one. Enough about, I'm not going to unload on you too much medical stuff otherwise. I want to talk about alternative treatments, a brief overview of what's conventionally available now. The first treatment in the US became available in 1993. That was betaseron. The second one on that list, which is more or less alphabetical in each section, interferon beta 1b. And the first group are all injectables. Now the newer ones are oral or infused medications. The last four are the most powerful, but they also have the most potential for bad side effects and for problems. So that's conventional treatment. What does alternative mean? Well, the word itself means to exchange, to go back and forth between things. Alternate comes from that. So in medical parlance, we say alternative treatment, basically a treatment that hasn't been proven yet. If something has been shown to work, it becomes standard treatment, if it's unequivocally shown to work. So it hasn't been really accepted by the medical community, given approval by the FDA. Most people assume that because things are natural, they can't hurt you. That may not always be true. And there's an important distinction. Some people think alternative medicine is something that should replace conventional treatment. And other people think, well, maybe the wiser thing is to do it additionally, to add it on. And in the case of MS, I think you would be better off using one conventional treatment and then doing things in addition, rather than stopping something that has been shown in studies to work and replacing it by alternative treatment. So there are many different kinds that have been tried in MS. There are some that started clearly in the alternative medicine world. Vitamin D, Biotin are two examples. Now everybody's using them, practically. Virtually every MS physician will be sure that their patients take vitamin D. Some of them are already recommending Biotin. So yes, they are still alternative, but they are virtually mainstream conventional by now. And there are a number of examples in the history of medicine where things started out in the alternative and then moved into the general medical treatment. Then there are treatments, the second ones, that are probably useful and probably harmless. And that's the gray zone, that probably doesn't hurt, and so why not give it a try? And we'll be talking about all of them a little bit. And finally, as another category, are not substances, but things you can do. And that's where, of course, disciplines like Qigong and Tai Chi and acupuncture and yoga and mindfulness and exercise, diet, lots of things that one can do in a very structured fashion that are definitely helpful. And then there's a category of alternative medicine, I have to say, that's definitely useless, provenly useless. Bee stings. People, this was a therapy. You tie a plastic bag around your leg and you put a lot of bees in there and you irritate them till they sting you. And that somebody thought was going to be helpful because it did something to the immune system, quote unquote. People were doing this all over the world, in this country and in Europe, had a big craze. And finally, the Dutch, credit must be given to them, did a formal study, was published. Of course, it doesn't work. So finally, that has become unpopular. In the last years, there was a big Italian vascular surgeon whose wife has MS. And in typical surgical fashion, when you're a hammer, everything is a nail. He thought what he knew about was vascular surgery, so he was going to operate on the blood vessels of the MS patients in his attempt to help his wife. And so people had balloon angioplasties of the big veins in the neck and around the spine. Quite expensive, quite dangerous. And of course, a lot of them felt better afterwards. When you go through a big procedure, you tend to want to feel that something was done, right? Oh, I'm already feeling better. And it now has been shown to be useless, finally. After a lot of money, a lot of risks, a lot of danger. Hyperbaric oxygen is when you have a diving injury, when you go up too fast, when you come up too fast, and you need oxygen with high pressure. People have done that in an attempt to improve the oxygen supply of the brain. It doesn't work in MS. And you can find on the internet and advertised lots of fake stem cell transplants clinics that are making jillions of dollars all over the world out of the desperation of people. True stem cell transplants can be helpful in MS. It's another whole long story. But these things that you find for a couple $1,000s, forget it. It's not going to work. Then, okay, we're supposed to go faster. No? Yeah, one more back. This was, for a long time, a big craze. People had their old dental fillings removed because of the mercury in there. You may want to have those removed anyway because they neither look nice nor are they pleasant to have in your mouth. Nobody hardly does them anymore, but there was no proof. And then all sorts of chelation protocols. So there are some more or less alternative things that are still unclear. One is cannabinoids. That's the active ingredient of cannabis, of marijuana. That is, you can get it as a nasal spray, as pills. Smoking is definitely not a good idea. No matter what you smoke, even if it's marijuana, bad. But if it's purified and if it's taken as a pill or as a nasal spray, maybe has some usefulness in spasticity and pain in MS, but it's still not clear. It's definitely bad for your cognition. If you've indulged in smoking any marijuana ever yourself, you know that it's not a good idea to do that before a math test. You're not going to do very well. And your memory long-term is going to get worse from it. And then there's a big subject about diet instructions, and I'm going to come back to that a little bit later also. There's the wall diet, the Gundry, Swank. There's lots and lots of claims that specific diets work wonders. I think specific diets can do a lot of good for people. And it seems that a low-salt, low-carb diet may be good generally in inflammatory conditions. I don't want to make a sweeping statement. Some of the claims, I think, of Wall and Gundry are overblown, but they may well be onto something. If you remember when I talked about infections, how they might actually fool the immune system to then attack tissues of the body, well, the diet ideas are along those lines. Namely, that one of the big surfaces in our body where we come into contact with the environment is actually your gut. You take things from the environment, you swallow them. And there's a lot of lymphatic tissue, a lot of immune tissue in the gut wall. And if proteins from various foods get in, because your gut is too quote-unquote leaky, then the immune system may recognize those, and if they bear any similarity to tissues in your brain and spinal cord, the immune system may get sensitized against that. So that theory is not that's not foolish. There might well be something to it. But currently, I think we really don't know which of those foods and which of those proteins actually may cause the damage. And particularly Ms. Wall and Dr. Wall and Dr. Gundry make very, very strong claims that I think are a little bit, we aren't quite there yet to be able to make those claims. But they may well be onto something. This is extremely important, not just for MS, but for heart disease and for strokes, provenly. If you harbor infections in your gums, your immune system will be kicked into high gears, and there appears to be a cross-reaction with the coronary artery linings from the bugs in your gums, and also the blood vessels that actually go to your brain, and then they become damaged and give you strokes and heart attacks. So this is very, very important. And antibiotics have a bad name because why? Of course, they ruin your gut microbes, the good ones also. However, there's one antibiotic, a tetracycline, that actually has been shown to have some efficacy in MS if taken on a chronic basis. So nobody knows yet whether that is going to come soon. It could be that tetracyclines knock out especially the bad bacteria in your gut and actually reestablish something. Who knows? Finally, before we get to the specific alternative treatment, there may actually be some substances that stimulate the immune system somewhat, and for that reason, they are actually recommended to not be taken in MS. One is echinacea. Now, echinacea is not going to stimulate it very, very much, but it may be some. And so if you have MS, it's probably better to stay away from it. The other ones, I wouldn't worry too much. Be careful whenever something just has Chinese on it and you have no idea what you're taking. And somebody says, oh, my neighbor's husband's second cousin's neighbor friend has taken that and it helped him. I would not advise saying, yeah, give me some. Don't do such things. There are some medications, cimetidine and others, that actually do stimulate the immune system, and those should be avoided also. Next one. And finally, before I get to the specifics, a few things that are very important to me to actually tell people about. Lillian is smiling because I always go on and on about that. There is a difference between two sets of facts being correlated, meaning they occur together, and one causing the other. There's the old classic example. Men who wear ties to work tend to make more money, at least that used to be the case, than men who don't wear ties to work. So the answer to poverty is not to hand out ties to men so they can wear the ties to work. It's the kind of work that makes you wear ties that gets you the money, and not. So there's a correlation between tie wearing and income, but there's no causation involved. And similarly, just because in a study you find that people who eat a lot of vegetables tend to not have as much colon cancer, you haven't shown yet that the vegetables prevent colon cancer. You've just shown that people who may be doing all sorts of other things to keep their health good tend to eat more vegetables. That's what you've shown. There's a correlation. And just because fact B, or fact number 2, occurs after fact number 1, doesn't mean that 1 caused 2. So you start taking a medicine and you feel, let's say, worse. That doesn't mean that the medicine made you worse. There may be other reasons. Or you start taking a medicine and then you feel better 2 weeks later. It doesn't mean that the medicine actually caused it. Just because we have no evidence for something doesn't mean we have proof that that something isn't there. That's a difference. And sometimes that's an argument used against alternative medicine. People say, well, we have no evidence that XYZ actually prevents this or that. Well, that may be true, but that doesn't mean that we have evidence that that's not the case. This is also very important. A lot of medical studies emphasize statistical significance. If you do a big study with thousands of patients, you can get statistical significances that are so impressive, p-values that are so low in statistical parlance. Everybody pays only attention to that. One has to look at, does it make a clinical difference? That is, how big is the effect for the patient, not what is the statistical significance of the effect. And one should never, ever generalize from single case reports. Single case reports can be a good basis for a study to look for in a bigger group, but not anything else. Next one. So let's get going with the real stuff, why you're here, what you wanted to come and hear about. Vitamin D. Basically, the biggest function that we've been aware for a long time of vitamin D is that it helps us absorb calcium and put that calcium into bone, to make a long, long story short. Probably up to 4,000 units a day are safe long term. The recommended daily allowance is just about 600 in the US and other parts of the developed world. They add vitamin D to milk, they add, I don't know, all sorts of things. It's fortified, so you get plenty generally. Most MS patients use 5,000 units a day. If you are really deficient as a small child, you will get rickets. You get weak bones and they will get bent, as the next slide I think shows. No, that's the chemical structure. Next one. So that's a 2-year-old with rickets. And you can see how the bones are bent in or curved. And so they get these kind of deformities. That has become extremely rare because very few children, luckily, become vitamin D deficient these days. Next one. There has been lots and lots and lots of evidence that when kids have low vitamin D levels, or even their mothers during pregnancy with them, if the mothers during pregnancy have low vitamin D levels, that the risk of MS in those kids as they grow up goes up, is much higher than the average. In MS patients, low vitamin D levels correlate with levels of disability. The lower the vitamin D level, the more disability and more MRI activity the patient tends to have. And notice that I've used the word correlate, not caused. We don't know that. It could be that when people have high disability and lots of MRI activity, they don't pay attention to their diet, they don't do weight-bearing exercise, they don't get out in the sun, therefore they have low vitamin D levels. But there is some proof that if you substitute vitamin D at 5,000 units a day in MS, that the MRI results will get better as opposed to patients who don't take the vitamin D. There's not yet definitive proof that the clinical situation gets any better. But since the MRI is a good gauge for the activity of MS, it's probably a matter of time of somebody to show that. Next one. What would be a good vitamin D level for MS patients? At least 50 or more, 60, 80, something nanograms per milliliter. There's a problem with if you send the same sample to different labs, you sometimes get different answers. The assays are not very well standardized for vitamin D. And sometimes they report them in millimoles per liter. So if you ever get a vitamin D level, you have to sometimes look around in the internet to convert between nanograms per milliliter and micromoles per liter. It's just a different units of measurement. Next one. Can you get sick from taking vitamin D? Yes, but you have to take enormous amounts for a long time. If you take 50,000 every day, long term, your calcium level in your blood will actually rise because you extract so much from the food and supplements, as well as even from your own bones, actually, that you will get heart arrhythmias, weight loss, muscle weakness, kidney stones, etc. And it's a good idea to check levels from time to time, blood levels, when you take high doses of vitamin D. Next. Yeah, I put that in for people who want to get the information. There are links where you can read more about it. Next one. So the other one I mentioned was biotin. Biotin is an old B vitamin. Well, there's actually debate whether it's a vitamin in the true sense, because some gut bacteria make biotin. They produce it as part of their metabolism. And there is the link to if your gut bacteria are not quote unquote normal, maybe the biotin producing bacteria are not there in you. Therefore, you have a biotin deficiency, quote unquote. Therefore, you get MS. That's one of the theories. It's a very simple molecule. And it's in a lot of supplements. For people take it for their hair and for their nails. A lot of these women's in the health food store or in the grocery store. What is it? Hair, nails, and so on. We'll have a little bit of biotin. Next one. It's a coenzyme of a certain. It's a cofactor of carboxylase of another enzyme, which is very important in creating fatty acids, which are part of the myelin, and also for the production of glucose in the liver. Certain gut bacteria will make it, and that's why we think it's important that the gut bacteria are as close to normal as you can get them. A protein in raw egg white is going to block biotin. It won't be absorbed. So there's no point in taking biotin supplements and having a couple of raw eggs at the same time. Won't do you any good. Next one. I'm going to skip over this. This is the way that biotin actually helps with fatty acid and glucose production. Next. So there's no official RDA, but there is a general sense that about 30 micrograms of biotin is enough per day. In the MS studies, 300 milligrams, not micrograms, 300 milligrams a day is used. And it's not clear what the scientific rationale for this 10,000-fold increased dose is supposed to be. A lot of people, cynical people, myself sometimes included, will say they want a patent for their stuff. Because right now, if you buy yourself those nail and hair supplements, you can get up to 10 milligrams per capsule. So you take 10 of them 3 times a day, you get the 300 milligrams. And it's a lot cheaper than getting the, well, right now you can't even get the biotin that they're using in the MS studies because it's not approved yet. Next one. This was the study. And go to the next one. It's a French group that actually developed this. But look at those numbers. 13% of ones treated with biotin had no increase of their disability over a couple of years. whereas in the control group that got placebo, none of the people had their disability remain stable. They all progressed. So this is a clear effect. 13% is it's good. But what about the 87% who took the biotin and got worse? So it's not a big effect. That's what I was talking about earlier. One has to look not only at statistical significance, look at that p-value. That's nice. That is statistically very significant. But is the clinical effect really that big? No, it's not. So biotin, I take some. I don't take quite as much. But there's a nice large study starting now. There's a large trial underway now in North America and Europe. If you want to look it up, those are the links. And we'll know in a couple of years if it was all a pipe dream or not. And we'll see. But it probably doesn't hurt. Next one. There's some disagreement about that. There's one MS doctor in Chicago who gave it to his patients, and he said that their MRIs got actually a little bit worse. And his theory is that because the biotin actually makes the remaining neurons work so hard metabolically through making fatty acids and glucose, etc., that it actually wears them out. People feel better while it lasts, but the cell simply becomes exhausted and dies. We'll see. If you use it, cook your eggs well, and don't take another alternative medicine called Alpha-Lipoic Acid at the same time, because biotin and Alpha-Lipoic Acid are in competition for the same transport mechanism in the gut. Next one. Okay, next one. You can get a printout or a links. Melissa can give you that. So what about some of these disciplines that I mentioned before? Well, next one. You've got a great resource here. And he's sitting right in the middle of the room. Marius is teaching this. And I, with Marius's permission, pulled this off the internet, this picture. I hope you're satisfied with it, that it's a good one of you. It does look like you. Next one. There are actually a few review articles on how these disciplines can have and what kind of helpful effects they may have in a variety of conditions. Marius, of course, knows a lot of this literature too. These are two other ones that I found. They are there are reviews of a good 100 case reports and dozens of studies. And I would encourage you to look at that. Next one. And if I can just make a few comments. I'm a conventional physician by nature. So when we came to Key Biscayne and decided, well, why don't we look into this? You were teaching that twice a week, and he is teaching that twice a week. It is actually a good idea to simply try it, to not worry too much about how it works or why it works, which is my tendency. I always want to figure out, so how's this supposed to work? It's a good idea to just have an open mind towards the traditional explanations of how these things get things into balance and to simply do it. And what I think you will find is that it induces a certain calm strength and relaxation. And just basically, it feels like your mind clears up. And you feel quite a bit of, I want to say, in-tuneness with environment, with other people. And it's very, very good to do this in a group. It's a totally different experience when you have an accomplished teacher like Marius doing it with a group of people than if you're watching a TV screen following a DVD. The personal presence is a different matter. And there may be other factors that simply are there when you are in the presence of an experienced teacher. And you feel much more in tune, or you feel simply reassured. And they can correct you as you're doing it. That little person in the TV screen will not say, no, wait a minute, you want to do it this way. You know, maybe in the future we'll have all robots that teach us, but I think for now, take advantage. Friday at 8:30 here in the building, and Sunday out on the greens if you're around. Try it. It's a good idea. And well, yes, it's really important. And the DVDs and books can be helpful once you get the hang of it. But then it's good to do it in person. Next one. Next one. Yeah. So Co-Enzyme Q is another one. There's one small study, just about 50 patients, but it had a very nice design, was randomized, double-blind, et cetera, and it clearly had a positive effect on fatigue and depression in MS. And that's not to be scoffed at. It may not change the MRIs, but as those of us who do have MS, fatigue and mood disorder, fatigue and mood disorders can be really making your life and the life of the people around you quite miserable. And so it's probably a good idea, but it's small studies. Even some of these blood tests where inflammatory parameters were changed by the coenzyme Q, but of course much larger studies are needed before one can recommend it for everybody. Next one. And then the whole thing of omega-3 and fish oil and gamma-linoleic acid. This has been around for at least the late 60s, early 70s. And poor studies, small studies, contradictory results. It's a big mess. And nobody really knows if it's advisable. If you take more or less reasonable doses of good quality fish oil, it shouldn't hurt. But don't count on it doing a lot of good. There's probably very little risk. Make sure you don't get loads of mercury from some cheap fish oil. That's important also. And it's a hopeless mess, and nobody's really going to sort it out, I don't think. Omega-6 of oils, which is actually surprising because most of the omega-6s, as opposed to the omega-3s, are felt to be stimulating inflammation, but the gamma-linoleic acid seems to be an exception. Next one. There were some studies in the 70s in England. A weak effect was said when the 3 trials of gamma-linoleic acid were reanalyzed in a meta-analysis, which is statistically very dubious, but there was a weak effect. Next one. And it's very popular. And the major oils that have a high concentration of gamma-linoleic acid, if you want to take that as a supplement, is primrose oil and borage oil. And you should try to get about this amount per day of gamma-linoleic acid. I do take it. I don't know. There's no way of knowing. Next one. Alpha-Lipoic acid I had previously mentioned as what? As a competitor of biotin for absorption. So you don't want to take this at the same time. So if you take a lot of these supplements, you can see how this is getting very complicated, and you have to kind of take something every 3 hours so this doesn't interfere with that, and then you have to remember, have I already taken it, or did I forget this afternoon dose of this now? It gets kind of complicated. Alpha-lipoic acid is used in diabetes also, and has some role to play in diabetic neuropathy. In MS, it's been studied, and it has actually shown some effect on MRI scans of MS patients. Does it work? We don't know yet, but there's a chance. Next one. Next one. So one has to remember to not take it at the same time as biotin, otherwise you don't get the full effect of both. There are some who say don't take the mixed form. This is a chemical issue of whether polarized light is turned to the right or left by the molecule. Take only the right enantiomer instead of the one that is a mixture. Who knows? And there are some reported side effects. It's also unclear if those are really due to the lipoic acid or not, but one has to watch for that. Here's a reference for that if you want to look it up. Next one. So the probiotics, hot. This is very hot in the alternative medicine world. The gut bacteria, and should we all be taking a variety of things? All of you who have tried to shop for probiotics, remember this feeling of standing in front of about 7 or 8 different ones at Winn-Dixie alone, leave alone CVS or other stores. They are different mixtures of different bacteria and different strengths, and nobody has any idea what they're doing with all that. There are claims that are easy to substantiate is that maybe your digestion will be more regular, your stools will be a little less soft or less hard, and you will have fewer belly cramps or fewer pains. Okay, that's not what we are interested in. We are interested in reestablishing this so-called natural, healthy gut system of bacteria, the ones that we want to have, that allegedly have become imbalanced through taking antacids and protein pump inhibitors when we have a sour stomach, or all the antibiotics that we swallow for infections. They will actually change the gut bacteria. And we want to reestablish the so-called normal thing. Nobody knows what to take. There are no truly definitive findings in MS, but this is a hot topic of research for many, many autoimmune diseases. It's just that anybody who says we know what we're doing isn't quite telling the whole story, or is making claims that are not yet substantiated. Next one. You got links to read. There's plenty of stuff to read. Next one. So taurine is one of the last. I'm going to be done in about 10 minutes, so don't despair. We'll get to the end of this. Taurine is a supplement. It's actually an acid with an amino group. Amino group is a chemical term, but it's not a typical amino acid, okay? Just chemically. It's in meat and bile. It was first found in the bile of oxens or bulls. Tauros, Greek, is the bull, and that's where it's got its name from. It's in a lot of the, what do you call it, so-called energy drinks. Red Bull got its name because they put a lot of taurine in there, actually. You know Red Bull? It's this crazy, it's basically Coca-Cola with a lot of taurine, I think. And actually, this substance, there's one article that I'm going to show in the next one, that it may actually stimulate the cells that make the myelin naturally. Next one. That's the chemical structure. There's the amino group, the NH2, that it got its name from. Next one. So oligodendrocytes are the cells in your brain that make the myelin. And in a Petri dish, in a cell culture, oligodendrocytes start to work better and more if you add some taurine. So here's another one where people often get confused. Just because you add a substance in a cell culture and cells start to do something doesn't mean that if I swallow a taurine pill that my oligodendrocytes are going to do anything. That's a big leap of faith and a big jump because we have no idea what doses to use, etc. But it may have a future. Next one. Curcuma. That's that stuff that gives curry its orange color. It's a root. And there was an 18-month study, actually not in MS, but in healthy older adults, and their memory tasks, they did them better. And it even had effects on PET scans. There was one study in MS patients that you've got here. Again, it's another pill. to think about. And so there are things that are being looked at and that are actively being researched. But the problem is we don't know what to take of all those things. Do you want to take all of these? Next one. These are some good resources if you really want to read what I talked about in an hour, roughly. If you want to read a lot more and get a lot more background information, I recommend this book. I know Dr. Bowling is a physician in Denver, and he was always one that was very interested in alternative medicine, and he's really done a lot of work and research. I can recommend his book very much. This is the publication by the National MS Society about alternative therapies, and you find the references also in there. And if you want to shudder at what kind of crazy things MS patients have all subjected themselves to in the past, this is an old book that you can still get on Amazon, Therapeutic Claims in MS. It's a publication by the MS Society. It's from the 80s. They don't even put it out anymore. But all the bee stings and the various things, you'll find them. It's an educational experience to read what desperate people like us are going to do because we're scared of this disease and because of what this disease can do. And people kind of sometimes go overboard with things and don't really use their critical intelligence before they are subjecting themselves to the most absurd things. Next one. So, I've talked about biotin, which are these little white pills. This is alpha-lipoic acid. This is taurine. These are GLA and fish oil and vitamin E. And the little one is vitamin D. And there's little B vitamins and C and a few conventional medications thrown in the middle. And this is just a portion of what I talked about and 1 day worth. So when you think of that, and then think about the arguments that a physician like Gundry is making about how we should eat only those things that we have evolved to tolerate. We certainly didn't evolve, our gut did not evolve to deal with this every day. So I have my own questions about how much sense it makes to take that much. We have no idea how these interact. There are no studies in that regard. But you do what you can, and you have to be willing to keep reading and to watch what develops. And you have to be careful, and sometimes things come out that, oops, you better not do this or that. And then you have to be willing to revise your strategy. So very often people start taking things, and they always add, and they never think about taking something off. So that's an important thing. And finally, I want to say this especially to those of you who may be personally affected by that. Don't take anything that I said here today or I will say today and let that override of what your doctor told you. So, and don't ever do things that your physician doesn't know about. That's silly. That's completely counterproductive. If you find that your physician is not willing to listen or doesn't want to talk to you about it, then find another physician. But find somebody who can deal with, that you have a good communication with, but don't keep things from them. And if they tell you, please stop doing that because blah, 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 then give that serious thought, because there may be many factors that we couldn't cover today where in your particular situation you should not be doing any of that. Okay? Next one. To summarize, there are a lot of things we can do to help MS patients feel better in general. In the United States, one doesn't have to drive home the truth about not smoking as much as one does in Europe. You wouldn't believe how people smoke in Europe. But here, I think the word has gotten around that that's a bad idea. But there's lots of literature in MS. And it's actually, just like with the gums, it's felt that smokers have chronic bronchitis, basically. And that activates your immune system to deal with bacterial infections and irritations of the bronchi. And you can't inhale hot smoke and not irritate your bronchi and have infections more than other people. Smokers cough, remember? So it's felt that that may be why cigarette smoking, even secondhand cigarette smoke, can make MS worse. Take care of your general health. If you're overweight, reduce your body fat percentage. This is not the place to go into detail about how to do that. But as you might surmise, exercise and diet changes may have something to do with it. In fact, doing a vigorous and consistent physical exercise program has proven beneficial effects on various MS parameters, how you feel, but also MRI scans. Attention to diet is important. Low carb, high fat is probably good. Low salt is good. But if I would have given this talk 20 years ago, I would have said the opposite. Not the low salt, I would have said low salt too, but I would have said low fat, right? Some people feel insecure because science changes. And I would argue that's what's supposed to make you feel secure, that science is able to change, to say, what we told you before was wrong. We learned something. That's actually a trustworthy feature. People who stick to dogma in face of evidence to the contrary, they have the problem, not people who change their minds on the basis of data. They are actually trustworthy. And manage your symptoms aggressively. That may involve medications, but many of these things can also be addressed with other measures that are not medications. Next one. Vitamin D, biotin, and alpha-lipoic acid are probably the three that have the biggest promise, and I think it's reasonable to take them. Of course, with advice and consent of your physician. They will likely become part of the standard treatment of MS. The other ones, maybe, but we need more data, especially about probiotics. And marijuana only in very, very narrowly defined specific situations and with great trepidation. Don't underestimate what this does to your cognition. So watch out. Next one. Finally, there are things that nobody can argue with. Qigong and Tai Chi, compared to everything else we have talked about, can only be good. I can't think of anything. With yoga, as long as it's gentle, fine. As long as you're relatively young, fine. But I would advise against any crazy, harsh things like this high heat yoga, this Bikram yoga, especially for MS, because heat actually makes us feel more tired, may not be so good. But also headstands or crazy contortions, I think that's not a good idea. Inverted positions, I'm not so sure. And pay attention to this. We get caught in hope and fear, and we get into families can be difficult because they don't understand. Colleagues at work can be difficult. And one needs to pay attention to one's relationships and to one's emotional well-being. And that's not easy when you're dealing with all these other things. But in the end, you can only have a sense of humor about it and keep an open mind. So that's, I think, all I have. Thanks for your attention. And if you have any questions, please go ahead. Oh, thank you. A lot of pills. I already took a lot of pills. Already, other ones, yeah. And I'm not pushing pills here.
No, I know.
I think it's reasonable to keep these things sort of in one's crosshairs and to follow them and to remain educated what comes out.
Everything you were saying, I mean, so there's it's kind of a contradiction. Oh, this is good, but it might not work.
Yeah.
This is good, and this might not work. Chances are gonna work.
Vitamin D is a safe bet for MS for sure. Biotin, we will only know in a couple of years, but chances are there are some studies out that were well done. These were not alternative studies. These French guys, these are the conventional physicians. They're very, very, However, they also own the patent. So now in the United States, this will be done by other people, and everybody is waiting with bated breath. Because when the people who stand to make jillions of dollars report a positive effect, you say, well, isn't that interesting? We'd like to have these guys over there that are not going to make any money from this drug do the same thing. And let's see what they find, because time and again, it goes out. But biotin, it may be useful. And lipoic acid, the risk is very low. It's been used by diabetics for a long time. Otherwise, yeah, you can make an argument for other things, but in terms of supplements, remember again, doing some of the other disciplines that we talked about that can induce a lot of well-being. Whether it undercuts the basic mechanisms of MS, probably not, but it will at least optimize the rest of the brain and of the body. So. That's useful. Marius?
To what extent these same recommendations, possible recommendations, are good for other autoimmune things?
Well, thank you for reminding me, because I meant to address that. Although it's tempting to put all autoimmune diseases in one pot, because the same kind of principles are at work. We know that there are crucial differences in some of the immunology of different autoimmune diseases. In fact, there is a medication that works very well in rheumatoid arthritis, which makes MS worse. When MS patients take that medicine, it's a TNF-alpha blocker. They get worse, and there are cases of MS being precipitated in rheumatoid arthritis patients who got that for their rheumatoid arthritis. So I think some of the principles about the molecular mimicry, whether it's from infections that you have or from being exposed in the gut to certain proteins, there could be overlap. And I think for the alternative, not for the regular conventional medicines, but for the alternative medicines, a lot of them will work or have a rationale in other autoimmune diseases just as well, for the same reasons, because they're a little bit less specific and potent, because we're talking about, with biotin, to help with fatty acid, proper fatty acid metabolism. And that's good in any autoimmune disease. So there are not any studies that I'm aware of specifically of alpha-lipoic acid in things like lupus, but only in diabetes.
In terms of stress, I think all autoimmune diseases are aggravated by stress levels.
Certainly.
In terms of sleep, in terms of nutrition, things like that. So when it comes to general health, there are probably ways in which they're all negatively impacted by levels of stress, not exercising,
Couldn't agree more. And in terms of things, the disciplines of Tai Chi and Qigong, obviously, yeah. And the big, in terms of epidemiology, the big diseases, autoimmune diseases, are of course rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and so on. There are many, many smaller forms that are actually more similar to MS, like Sjogren's disease. Oh, I'm sorry. There are are some rarer autoimmune diseases that are similar to MS, such as Sjogren's disease. And there are actually some syndromes that used to be felt to be special forms of MS, like neuromyelitis optica and some other ones, anti-MOG, antibody syndrome. They are now separated away from MS and are considered special diseases. And so for them, of course, the same considerations would hold true. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Morris. Thank you, Melissa.